Hey guys, what's up? And forgive me for the sound. I'm hoping it sounds good in final production, but I've been having some weird issues with it for a while. I'm wondering if I need to replace the mic again, but that's neither here or there, right? So let's just get on with it. Get all the usual stuff out the way that I usually put in the beginning of these videos. So, let me ask a question that some might consider to be somewhat controversial, slightly controversial, and one that I'm pretty sure that people are going to automatically assume they know the answer to. Are fighters from the past, when it comes to, okay, let me amend that. Let's start over. Are traditional martial artists from the past, particularly when it comes to Chinese martial arts, though I guess if you want to, you can bring other Asian martial arts into this question as well. Are traditional fighters better and can, possibly even defeat fighters of today? Yeah, we're asking that question. I'm pretty sure it's something that, has been brought up before. Are like experts of like traditional martial arts, particularly the Chinese martial arts, in the past, are they going to be better than the ones that we have right now? Or modern day fighters much more sophisticated and obviously can't be beaten? I am pretty sure you guys already have an answer in your head as to what's true or not. And I'm going to say that the answer might, even if the answer that I'm going to come up with or the answer that I'm going to suggest, even if you think you've probably gotten in your head, it might not be for the reasons that I'm going to present. But who knows? Probably that are on the same wavelength. What got me wanting to talk about this was a podcast that I recently listened to. There is a podcast called Hardcore History by Dan Carlin. It's one of my favorite podcasts, period. In a funny sort of way, he kind of has a, he, puts out podcasts on basically history and historical events that, he approaches it from an angle that you don't really see a lot of other people bring to it. And he does focus a lot on war history. Like, he talks a lot about World War II. He talks about, like, politics of, like, the stuff before that. He talks about ancient civilizations, usually from, the angle of war and combat. But he does bring up other historical topics and events as well. He also happens to have a lot of large gaps in between episodes, which is what's making me laugh because it's kind of similar to my channel, but whatever. I like this. This is not going to be the first time that I've referenced his podcast, by the way. The video that was actually supposed to be going up before this one, I'm also going to be referencing it. But I wanted to put this video out first, and because I don't want to throw out the video that I was planning on putting out without giving you guys a nice little martial arts one first. So, but anyway, I was listening to it, and he actually has two podcasts. Sorry. See, already I'm like messing things up. He has Hardcore History, and then there's a supplemental one called Hardcore History Addendum, where he will bring up, like, subtopics, side topics, things like that. And this particular episode, he brings up something that you'd think is completely out of left field for the material he normally talks about. And it was boxing, because he is a fan of boxing. And so am I, at least in the old days. I used to like watching old boxing matches. And he brought up something that I hadn't really considered, though it is something that I'd heard before. And it was basically that there is a consensus among old-time boxers and boxing aficionados and old coaches and so on, that the boxers of old were better fighters than the boxers we have now, despite improvements that we've had on training and, nutrition and like the overall condition of our, of the athletes, the fighters we have today, and so on and so forth. Now, common thinking these days will basically go with the side of thought that, that's impossible. That, look at so many other fields of human knowledge and skill that we have. things consistently improve over time. That's the general view. If you look at, say, different, like other sports, some may say that, the athletes in other sports like football, baseball, basketball, you'll see improvements in greater feats of, skill, though some might argue the opposite as well. But, you look at different things, different forms of human endeavors, and we constantly see improvements. Especially in the form of human knowledge, you see, like, growth in, how sophisticated and how much more we know in those fields of study and in those fields of knowledge. Our sciences have been improving. Our ideas of nutrition overall seem to have improved. We seem to know more and more about the effects of them on the body. Though I know there's going to be some people arguing that, there's ancient wisdom that people are ignoring. Yes and no. I don't want to get into that. But generally speaking, there's a consensus that things have improved over time. So you would think, especially when it comes to combat, that things have improved. Warfare and combat in particular has certainly seen leaps and bounds. People will argue, like, look at the way war is, waged. Look at how war is waged, the battle plans that have been used, the weapons that are used, and the tactics that, we use with these weapons, and how we, how we, manipulate troops on the battlefield, how we manipulate the landscape, how we gather information, so on and so forth. Here's the thing, though, and this is the argument that they're going to be making as far as boxing is concerned. There has been a shift in what is, like, there's a shift in focus on what is the goal in making a fighter in boxing. What's more important? What are the skills that are actually being worked towards? What is the ultimate goal that we're trying to reach with the boxer in terms of how effective they are in the ring? And you will note that when that focus is shifted, the boxer that is produced is a different type of boxer than one that would have come about in the past. And the one in the past may have actually been better equipped to deal with fighting than the ones that we have now. Here's some of the arguments that people who are making, who are making the argument that the old fighters are better. Here's some of the things that they're bringing up. One, they bring up the amount of fights that are being fought. Nowadays, if you look at, like, say, the number of fights that somebody will go through before they're considered to be champion material and they go and get the belt, and then later on there are a lot of fights that they get after they declare champion. If you look at the number of fights they have, like, say, in our era, in the 2000 era, and then you go back to, say, like, the 1930s, the 1940s, 1950s, you'll notice something. Fighters fought a lot more often back then. A lot more often. Like, you go further back, it gets to, like, ridiculous numbers where you start wondering, how the hell did they survive so many fights? Because we know what can happen to somebody who constantly has to deal with blows to the head and to the body. You start to break down. The body can only take so much punishment before there starts to become, rather disastrous effects upon them. But yet, you look back there and they're like, could have up to, like, hundreds of fights. Like, sometimes you'll see, like, an average of 2 fights per month. Like, wait, what? 2 fights per month? And yet they did it. And many of those fighters didn't necessarily end up walking around with brain damage. I mean, because I'm pretty sure if we start scouring, we might, know otherwise, or maybe we knew less about medical stuff. We didn't know less about the mind back then. And they might have been acting in a way that could have suggested some form of brain damage. But by and large, on average, they seem to have been able to do okay. Now, the reason why I'm bringing up number of fights is because of one very simple fact. The more you do something, the better you get at it. If we're just going with raw numbers, if fighters in the past went through a lot more fights than the fighters we have today, well, that would suggest, just from the aspect of experience and constant doing something over and over, that already gives an edge to the older fighters in terms of the amount of skills that they would have acquired from consistently, performing this art, constantly doing this. Anybody, like, a musician is constantly working on, their craft of making music. They get better, they get more sophisticated, they find out new things. Somebody's constantly working on their calligraphy, their hand becomes finer, that, the movements that they do, you can see how much they've improved the more they do something. Anything. Like, let's take fighting games. I love Tekken 7, but I don't play it nearly as often as, say, somebody who's going to be training to, go play at EVO. And it shows, it's obvious. They're able to do things, and they're able to pick up on certain subtleties that I can't even begin to try to work with. They're working out strategies, and I'm like, oh, I'm not ready for that yet, because they do it more often. So they're, they've built it in themselves to be able to play at a higher level. This is something that any form of human endeavor, you can see this, and it was certainly clear with boxing. Another aspect when it comes to this is because of people constantly fighting and training, and not only that, also having to be able to fight, have to be able to stand up and fight more often. There is less emphasis on just getting in there and just bashing your way through, and more emphasis on being sophisticated. Like, there are strategies, and there's certain movements, and there like certain, techniques involved in boxing, especially in old style boxing, that you don't really see done anymore. And worse, it's people who don't know how to even teach that anymore, much less have people train in it. Like, there's things in older styles of boxing that has, quite frankly, become a lost art, at least according to those who know this art well. And it's funny, you'll see even like in the 30s and 40s, people lamenting that there's something already being lost in boxing. Jack Dempsey, who's considered one of the best fighters around, even Tyson loves talking about this guy, he was lamenting as time went on that boxing seemed to have been going on a downward slide. I don't want to get too much into it, because then they'll make this a completely different video. We'll be just talking purely on boxing. I just want to kind of bring up some of the things that are brought up when they're arguing about how the boxers of old were better than the ones we have now, and that, like, the boxers of old, they fought more often, they had more experience, the strategies and techniques that they were performing were more sophisticated, they were they're more subtle. And subtlety, by the way, subtlety in an art really shows off skill. The more you see something that is being done mostly in broad strokes, or like in a general way, like the more you see that, the more it shows that the person probably hasn't delved too deeply into whatever it is that they're doing. But when you start seeing that subtle skill, when you start seeing these tiny little things done very well and in a way that kind of blows your mind, if you know what to look for, that shows you, oh, they really know what they're doing. And there's less and less of that in boxing. Even the way they train has gotten different. Like, in the old days, apparently, there really wasn't much done in the way of weight training. There was hitting the heavy bag, there was shadow boxing, having good footwork. That stuff was in there. But as far as, like, doing a lot of heavy lifting and building up your muscle mass and constantly going for power shots and stuff like that, that wasn't really in there. In fact, boxers of old understood that in order to deliver a devastating blow, as far as, having a really good, powerful punch, it's speed and snap that's important, not pure muscle mass. You're not just trying to smash your way through it. In fact, any martial artist will tell you that snap, the proper angle and speed and good body mechanics, is what's going to knock a dude out. And in fact, this is a common thing that you hear, but it's true, in that, when you're constantly packing on extra muscle, you're slowing yourself down. Now you're having to do more of this to get your arm to go in, and instead of the quick straight snap and straight shot. So that in itself is kind of deteriorated, and getting in to deliver that blow effectively without getting hit has also kind of deteriorated. Like, and nowadays you'll see certain boxers who they'll take a hit to deliver a hit, thinking that, well, I'll absorb the blow so I can bash them, and I know my punch is going to be more effective because they're wide open. And in the past, they wouldn't go for that strategy. Anybody, by the way, who's into traditional martial arts, who's had discussions about, what's effective, what's not, is our art effective? Some of this it's probably sounding quite familiar to you, isn't it? Because you can see a lot of the same things being discussed when it comes to fighters of old versus fighters of today. Except the funny thing is, when it comes to traditional arts, then when people bring this stuff up, it's usually thrown back into them as, oh, that's just an excuse. You suck. Your art sucks. But in boxing, we can actually see stuff that would make old affection, older connoisseurs and older boxers and old trainers, they'll bring it up, and they're not going to say, oh, this is an excuse. We're like, oh, you got a point. One more thing that I think is going to be relevant before I dive into my final point here, and it's the effect of fiction on boxing, particularly Rocky. It was brought up in the podcast how after Rocky, because like in the Rocky movies, Sylvester Stallone, especially in the later films, would be this huge cut up sort of massive sort of dude, like the big muscles and the fine chest and all that stuff. And younger boxers were looking at that and going, whoa, we got to look like that. And then people, aspiring boxers, were like, oh, man, that's what you got to look like. Oh, I want to get it. And that was their idea in their head of what a boxer was supposed to be. Meanwhile, you look back at fighters of old, they weren't built like that. They had no reason to be built like that. They had to be built a different way in order to properly apply their art. Because, again, muscle mass wasn't the goal. Effectiveness with your hands were. Having the stamina to stay in the ring was more important. Being able to, slip, bob, and weave was more important. So these things started to go by the wayside when it became more about weight training, delivering heavier blows, and also you have to also understand that this is a sport and it's an entertainment sport. So you have to make the fights look more exciting, and things that look more exciting is like bam, bam, bam. Sophisticated fighting techniques is something that, unless you really know the art, you're not going to really appreciate. The crowd, there's certain things you're going to be able to do in certain ways you position yourself or whatever, that a trained eye would be like, awesome. And the average goer is like, what the hell's going on? There's all these factors in effect. So with that said, how can we then approach these same factors when discussing fighters of old in traditional martial arts compared to fighters now? Well, I'm seeing a lot of parallels, if I'm going to be honest. The main thing that strikes me is the discussion of the lack of sophistication and the lack of people who can actually teach the techniques and strategies that were done in the past. Let's be frank with one another. There are very few teachers who fully understand the arts the way they were employed in the past, if there are any left. There's a lot in Chinese martial arts, and I'm speaking from that because that's the field that I was in, still in, but just not as deeply as I used to be. There's it's become common knowledge that there's just a lot that's been lost. Then there's stuff that's been trying to be regained. Now, granted, we see this a lot. Chinese martial arts has lost and sort of rebuilt skills before. I'm just thinking right off the bat, Piguozhong, which was an art that almost completely died out before they found a way to bring it back by kind of reconstructing stuff in the past. So this stuff happens. But by and large, there's a lot of stuff that's done in Chinese martial arts that today we look at it and basically there's stuff that was done in the past that nowadays we look at it and go, what the hell was this for? And we just don't know. The common thing to do is just simply, we don't need to do that anymore. It's useless. Or this is probably dance or whatever. But there probably was a really good reason why that was in there. Maybe there's something weird about the footwork or something about the head placement or something about how the hands move that makes sense, when done by someone who understands why they were employed that way, in the context of it being employed that way. But nowadays, that's out the window. There's so much stuff now. We're just like, what the hell? I don't even know what that is. We're not going to do it anymore. And the art loses effectiveness because of that. You got to remember that if something is structured around a particular context and then you take that out, you're now like it's kind of like a fish out of water sort of thing, if you get what I'm trying to say. It's like, if let's just say that there was a certain way that your combat art needed to be employed, and there were certain like subtle strategies and tactics that needed to be done in order to make those particular techniques work, but then you forgot about those things. The person who's teaching you doesn't know that stuff. Then these higher level things, you're not going to know how to do because he didn't pass it on to you. And unless you're able to kind of figure it out for yourself, it's gone. It's completely gone. And I'm thinking this is part of the reason why later on, when it came to like modern fighting arts, when we started seeing MMA and all this other stuff, you saw a lot of people training in traditional arts who didn't really know how to employ what they were being trained in, because the people who trained them didn't know how to teach this stuff to them. And in the ring, they get knocked out. Then you say, oh, your art sucks, And what's funny is that nowadays you will see traditional martial artists trying to adopt modern stuff in order to make their techniques work. So they're looking more and more like, contemporary fighters. Their stances look more like boxing stances. Their footwork looks more like modern footwork. And they're throwing a lot of traditional stuff out the window. Like, the only thing that I'm really seeing being kept is maybe like the way they generate power is more or less staying the same, and certain hand techniques and certain trapping techniques, just kind of seeing that. And like easier to employ traditional stuff they're able to put in. But a lot of more sophisticated stuff, that's just gone. Like, it's very rare to find modern people being able to use that in a modern setting. And the reason given is generally like, it's useless. We don't need to do that anymore. This shows, again, what happens when people who knew how to do something before, it's gone, which is, again, the problems that people who are bemoaning the decline of boxing, at least in their eyes, the decline of boxing, this is the same thing that they're complaining about. Certain techniques not being, the old ways are no longer taught because no one knows how to do it anymore. And well, you can see the same thing in traditional fighting. So that alone would suggest that older fighters are better than the fighters today. Now, there is a counter argument in that you could easily say, well, the older fighters, they won more, like, because I know that there are people say the older guys are much better than the guys now. And usually there's this consensus of, it's because, we were listening to legends and myths. Of course, they're going to make them sound like they were better back then. Especially since back then they didn't know as much about fighting as we do now. I'm pretty sure if we throw in a modern dude now, he'll destroy him. But, back then they were all generally at the same level of knowledge on what it takes to win a fight. And they were probably all committing the same type of mistakes. So one guy was better at exploiting those mistakes than the other. And I'm pretty sure you're going to hear that type of counter argument. But remember what I said about how often people fight. A lot of the experts of old were in a hell of a lot more fights than the people calling themselves experts now. Right? I mean, one of the complaints that people have about traditional artists is that they just don't actually go out and fight. They just stay in their gym or whatever, or they're going and they just punch the air. They might do some sparring maybe, but they don't really compete, and they certainly aren't going out challenging other schools or beating people up or anything like that. But people in the past did, and they had a lot of fights under their belt. Remember, again, experience and doing something often counts for a lot. And then there's training methodology, what you train in, what you're actually trying to, accomplish, what's your focus when you're training and fighting. There was certain focuses in certain arts that they wanted to build up in order to make you a more efficient fighter. Nowadays, everything is being homogenized into this kind of modern thing of build up muscles, build up power, smash your way in. We could make another counter to this, though, about techniques being lost. I don't think necessarily that something has been lost is lost forever. Human beings have a knack of kind of regaining things or relearning things, because by and large we have similar brains, as the people who came up with stuff in the first place. And it's funny how techniques that we consider to be useless are coming back because people are beginning to remember how to use them again. One thing I love bringing up are kicks, for instance. When MMA really started getting popular and, it was like, the ground and pounding was winning all the time, first people were saying that, you got to grapple. Striking, this is proven that striking is useless. Don't even bother learning how to strike. Well, that went out the window after a while when people started learning how to counter the grapples, and then after a while learning how to stand and fight started getting important again. And then as far as kicking goes, it's like, well, there's only like maybe 3 kicks that are worth using. Anything else is garbage. Can't use side kicks in an MMA because it's useless. Can't use spinning moves in MMA. That stuff's useless. Spinning, what are you spinning for? You become exposing your back to the nasally. That's disappearing quick, isn't it? She's not even with kicks when it comes to spinning moves. Like we're seeing spinning elbow, spinning back fist, landing perfectly. Before you wouldn't see that. People are as people are fighting more and more, and as they're mixing it up more and more, old stuff that had been thrown to the wayside is being rediscovered. And this stuff's actually useful. We just didn't know how to employ it, which kind of led some credence to the argument that the guys in the old knew what they were doing. The people nowadays don't necessarily, at least not at the same level. So I can see that argument. Like I remember before when I would hear, the guys from old were better than the guys now. I used to take it with a grain of salt. Like, I kind of see what you mean, but I don't know. And now I'm having to re-examine this from a different context, especially after looking at it from the view of boxing, because I'm seeing a lot of parallels. The argument that people are making that, boxers were much better, and you can actually see they're coming up with really good, solid arguments. And I'm thinking part of the reason why it's a little bit more apparent with boxing than it is with traditional fighting is because boxing more or less has stayed competitive. Once it became a spectator sport, it became, it's an art, but it's also a spectator sport that is continued. So you can, and then not only that, we are recording it. We filmed fights. We got people documenting it. We got people discussing it. You got people, trainers training fighters who are training other trainers who are training other fighters. You can see and go down the, history to kind of compare and contrast and like, hey, I'm seeing something here. Traditional martial arts, yeah, they're lineages, but you don't see like the same level of like examination is only recently happening with traditional martial arts. And unfortunately, by the time you see this, that kind of rigorous, examination was when they were already in a decline. So I think that's why it's a little bit harder for people maybe to be able to like kind of look at it and go, yeah, maybe the fighters were better. Like, look what they were doing back then. Because we regulate these older fighters like, oh, these are tall tales. This is myths and legends and such. But there might be something to the claim that traditional fighters are better than modern ones, especially when you look at it in the form of like boxing, because with boxing, that argument is definitely can be made. So anyway, hope this little, and again, I'm saying that this argument can be made and I'm finding myself agreeing with it, but who knows? There probably is a strong counter argument to it as well. I'm not saying that, I believe this is 100% right. I will admit, I do believe it, but I'm open to counter arguments. And with the traditional martial arts, I know it's an even trickier subject to bring up considering all the other baggage when it comes to discussing what's better, what's not, were they better, are modern fighters better, is the approach better? There's a whole can of worms with that. But I'm thinking that there is some merit to looking at it in that way. So, anyway, I hope I, brought some food for thought, something for you guys to think about and discuss, which is what I like to do with these videos, like bring up something to have us start thinking about it. And I'll catch you guys later.